Welcome to Xagility. I'm your host, John Coleman.
Hi everyone, I'm Tobias Mayer here, and I'm the author of a book called The People's Scrum. See the image at the background there. I'm someone who came to the IT world very late in life and came to Scrum and Agile quite early on in the late 90s. So IT in mid 90s and immediately to Agile and Scrum in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I've been pursuing a career around that ever since then.
Tobias Mayer, welcome to the show.
Hi, John.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's good to be here.
Thank you so much. Tobias, I'm delighted you're here. In your introduction there, you mentioned that you were late getting into IT and that you were actually involved in Scrum in the very early days, late 90s and so on, and early 2000s. But what was your journey to Scrum? Like, how did where did you start, if you like?
I was 35, I think, when I went and studied software engineering. Before that, my career had been, I didn't really have a career. I had various jobs all over the place and mostly working in the field of community work, which actually was very helpful when I came into the Scrum world, to the kind of workshops I used to run with disenfranchised young people and refugees was very helpful in the kind of work that we do here. But when I studied software development, I was very interested in process, funnily enough. I don't quite know why. I was sort of drawn to it. Metrics and process were the things that fascinated me. Process mostly because it was mad, the way that people develop software. And so I started doing some project work around that. And in my research, I came across this thing called extreme programming, which is very new back in 1997. And I think it was before the book was, it was definitely before the book was published, but there was a couple of papers out. And funny enough, I discovered XP by reading a critique of XP by someone who found it very distasteful. Didn't fit the mainstream, but it was that made me think, oh, I'm going to look into that. That's very curious. So I came across it then and sort of followed it. And I used to go to some testing conferences back then around the metrics work I was doing. And I met Lisa Crispin, who was the first agilist I met, and she had just recently published a book called Agile Testing, I think, or Extreme Testing, I think it was called, her first book, Extreme Testing. And so I kind of chatted to her and began to investigate this field a little more. And when I moved to the States in 1999, I think that was about the same year that the XP book came out. I remember getting a copy of it and realizing that the work I was doing was very, very far removed from what they were describing in this book. But that was the way it was back then. You had to earn a living. But eventually I shifted companies and eventually was promoted to an engineering manager. And I knew nothing about management. So I had to start digging into that. And I went to the forums. I went to the Agile forums. Well, it was the extreme testing forum that I was on mostly. And through that, I heard about Scrum and I kept, well, what is this thing that everyone's referring to? And so I started looking into that and bought the book, read the book, and was profoundly moved by it, actually, in an odd way. It really touched me. And I saw all these connections with what they were talking about in the world of Scrum and how to manage people and how to successfully run an organization. It paralleled so much the kind of work I had done in the community field. And so I could continuously see these connections. And I thought, this is calling me. And so sort of shifted into it from there. And that was, when I read the Scrum book, it was probably about 2003, I think. And so I found out that there was this certification course that Ken ran, and so I went and did that and began to implement Scrum and XP practices at the company I was working with at the time. Sort of things went on from there.
How long did it take from the time that you read the book and say you had your kind of eureka moment to actually practicing it, or even between reading the book and maybe going to Ken's course?
Yeah. How long before I started practicing it? Well, I suppose I began to start implementing some of the ideas from it in the teams I was working with. Just things like having daily check-ins and the ideas of pairing, getting people to work in pairs. It was a sort of a meld between XP type pairing and Microsoft type pairing, which was developer tester pairing that they had written about well before that as well. And really just kind of like fast iterations through the work we were doing and testing as we go rather than testing at the end. And just sort of various little practices like that. We never actually did full-on XP where I was. And I have never done full-on XP, sadly, and never been in a position to do that. I've adopted many of the principles and practices of it. And again, with Scrum, it was a bit of a mishmash. I was an engineering manager. I was also a Scrum Master, which is, of course, as we know, forbidden. But I did that and sort of making it up as we went along based on what we understood. But reading the book, you said the eureka moment, there was actually quite a few. You know, I don't know if I read that book now, it's not like a brilliantly written book or anything, but it's the Mike Beadle and Ken Schwaber one. But the ideas in it just resonated so much with me. And I thought, this is how I want to be in the IT world. I want to be with this in the IT world, because everything else I see, everything else in terms of process and the way work gets done and the interactions between people is quite honestly appalling. And I was shocked by it because I worked in community fields and I worked in the arts, and people are much more respectful, much kinder, much more collaborative in those fields than they ever were in the corporate world. So I knew that I needed to sort of like veer towards that.
And it's interesting as well, Tobias, the last few years has been kind of a trend towards Scrum, for example, outside IT. I'm curious how you feel about that and the direction that Scrum is kind of going in at the moment.
Yeah, I recognized quite early on that Scrum was something more than a way of developing software. XP is a way of developing software. That's what it's designed for. Scrum was designed for that, but it never really talks about the practices of writing code in the way that extreme programming does. It talks about managing the situation much more.
So Tobias, you've been working in Scrum in the IT world, and one of the things that I've been noticing over the last few years is starting kind of with the 2017 guide, I think they started mentioning kind of more kind of generic terms, but still lots of software terms in there. But then in 2020, it was like a 99% job. The word developer is still there, but it's really making it very generic to be applied almost any type of knowledge work. And I'm just curious how you feel about the direction that Scrum is going, where it's going not necessarily just for software anymore, but actually kind of beyond that.
Yeah, I never really saw Scrum as a software development methodology. It was a management structure, perhaps, if you like, more than anything else. It's a way of containing the work. And so if it's containing the creative work of software development, it could contain the creative work of many other things as well. As you mentioned the term knowledge work, I think a bit perhaps broader than that as any kind of creative work. It's work when we're making something that we don't quite know what it's going to be. There's an awful lot of work like that in the world, and there always has been. And there's an awful lot of work that's not like that as well. And that's where Scrum isn't particularly useful, repeating manufacturing type work. But the work of creating things is where Scrum works really well. And so I welcome the fact that they've removed almost all references to software in there. It's absolutely silent on anything to do with development practices, because the writers of the guide know that you can't create software unless you have good practices. It's a given. Don't even start this. Don't actually take on Scrum if you don't know how to write software properly, because you'll fail. So you need to begin by having some really sound practices of software development in place. Extreme programming.
Yeah, I go along what you're saying, Tobias. I've seen lots of debate about the 2020 guide, but overall, I see more pluses than minuses, I would have to say. I like the direction that it's going in. I mean, things are never perfect. There's always room for improvement. And I've been doing a lot of work in non-software for the last 5 years. I go along with what you're saying. I think the only struggle is like when you can't do something in 30 days, you know, what you do then kind of thing. But
you can always do something in 30 days or less, I think. You know, I did this experiment once, John. It started around 2009. There was a downturn in the economy and there's a lot of unemployment. A lot of project managers were out of work. And I was a certified Scrum trainer, have been for some time now. And I decided to start offering what I rather tongue-in-cheek entitled welfare CSM. And welfare CSM workshops were essentially pay what you like. But you could only come if you brought someone along with you who had nothing to do with IT, right? So you had to bring a guest and then you could come and pay what you like to join the class. And I ran, maybe about 20 of these over the course of a year in various locations, and met some amazing people in that time, people who were working in fields that had nothing to do with software. And they were coming to support their friend who was out of work and looking to get a certificate. And they would come along and I would tell them what the purpose was of this. So for me, it wasn't like so much giving something away as learning something new. And I was learning, how can I apply Scrum in all of these different contexts? So science research was one, law was another one, running a yoga business was another one. So various things. I even had a taxidermist job. So
were there any kind of little nuggets for us that you picked up along the way when you?
What, John? Sorry.
Little nuggets, things that you discovered, little gold nuggets, so to speak, something. And when you met these people, you realize, oh, I didn't realize this, and so you had to kind of bring all the considerations to bear in order for Scrum to work really well for them.
Gosh, I mean, there are lots of those. Yeah, there was no one thing. There was many small things and ways of learning about the application of this. But one of the things you said is like sometimes you can't make things in 30 days, and that was very often one of the objections. Well, how can you possibly? But we always used to find that you can. There's always a way of breaking things down. We have natural ways of starting and ending things from our own cycles of life. When we start working on something, we try and get to a finishing point by the end of the day. So then we can go to bed and have a sleep and eat and things, and then get up the next day and start again. And it's quite nice to get things to a point where it feels somewhat complete. Because if you leave too many things half finished, we never know quite where to pick up again, right? So we've got a natural way of ending things. And I think if we apply that natural way of ending things to the work that we do, we'll always be able to fit the work into the time that we have in a meaningful way and not just have lots of unfinished work around.
So after the break, I wanted to just talk a little bit about Kanban. So getting back to finishing thing, you're talking about getting stuff done on a day or within a 30-day period. We should surely come up with something. And what I'm curious about, Tobias, is what other approaches have you looked at, or maybe sometimes you mix and match? Is Scrum always the answer, I guess, is kind of what I'm asking you. What have you tried and what have you noticed?
If you strip Scrum down to its bare bones, what you have is something you might call the creative process, the way of making something, where in order to make something, let's say for somebody else, you have to talk to that person before you start the work. While you're doing the work, you have to kind of check in with yourself or with your co-workers to make sure that what you're doing is on track. And then at the end, you review the work with your customer. That's a very natural thing to do. That's what we've been doing for centuries. And then perhaps we would talk about how we can get better at the work we do. So there's nothing unique about Scrum. It's just kind of how people have done creative work since the dawn of time. It's how we've made all the things we've made through that process. We cannot do it, and that's what's happened in organizations, actually. We have been not doing it. We've been thinking that we can do all our planning ahead of time, and everything's going to be correct if we get the requirements right, all this kind of madness. So we've lost sight of how to do natural creative work. We think creative work is like manufacturing work, or we think it's like engineering. It isn't. Software engineering isn't engineering. It's the wrong metaphor for it. Craftsmanship is a better metaphor. Maybe not perfect, but better.
That's where I'd like to go next, the state of agility, because you kind of hit the nail on the head there for me, because even though it's been a natural thing for centuries, it's kind of amazing how so many organizations struggle with this stuff. Sometimes for kind of reasons that are kind of beyond my understanding, and sometimes, there are some reasonable excuses, shall we say, but still there seems to be this trend of, for want of a better word, agile BS. Just how could you get it more wrong kind of stuff.
But I'm aware that I don't think I answered your question on you asking about Kanban and mixing and matching, I think was the term you used.
Thank you very much, Tobias. Yeah, so you're basically saying that Scrum could be, kind of go back to the essence of Scrum, which is creativity, the creative process. But yeah, in terms of like what else you've tried when you're looking at that creative process, maybe you found the answers elsewhere other than Scrum as well. I don't know. I'm just curious what you tried and what you've observed.
Well, yeah, it's in the nature of the work. I think almost all software is the building of new products, if not all software development is the building of new products. And so when we're doing new products, we need to have a particular way of doing that, which is the creative process. You're building a new product, you don't know what it's going to look like at the end. Scrum is there to help us work building things that when we don't quite know what they are. When we know exactly what they are and they're repeatable, then probably don't use anything like Scrum, because it's not the natural process for that. And you say, do I encourage teams to use Kanban or various other things? Not especially, no, but then I don't encourage people to use Scrum either. I encourage them to work in mindful, thoughtful ways based on the experience of how they operate in the world outside of the work. We have a natural way of showing up in the world and doing things and getting things done, cooking dinner, cleaning the house, raising the children, figuring out how to get from A to B. All of these things are very Scrum-like in their essence, right? There's not that much different. You can break it down. Like I said, you abstract it right out. You have this abstract class of some very basic things, and we find that they show up all over the place. But when we're doing repeatable things, then we don't use that process. If you've got starting a new job, for example, it's a creative process to figure out the best route to get to work. But once you've figured it out, it's a repeatable process. You just do it. You don't have to think about it anymore. You can now pick up a book and read, or put your headphones on, and you don't have to do it in a mindful way anymore. You do it in a mindless way. Lots of work is mindless work. It doesn't make it bad work. It just means that we've got to the point where we don't have to worry about it. It's great. We want to get there. We want to automate everything in the software world, don't we? That we can automate. Everything that can be automated should be and must be automated. And when it isn't, we spend an awful lot of wasted time doing things that robots could do better.
Yeah, and that's the other thing as well. The threat of the robots and AI taking over. You stay as a single skill specialist, you're kind of prime target for a robot, really, aren't you?
Yeah. One of the things that people focus on a lot with when they talk about Kanban is limited WIP, limited work in progress, as if that was invented by the people that kind of put the process together. Of course, Scrum limits WIP. James Coplain has written about this a lot. I've written about this too. He writes about it better, about how Scrum has a WIP limit of 1. Really worth looking into that. That's the concept of Scrum is it has a WIP limit of 1. And anything above 1 is suboptimal. So when you've got a WIP limit of 1 and you're always focused on it, you don't have to keep talking about WIP limits, because there's only one thing. You're only working on one thing. The other thing I like there's aspects of Kanban. I like the way that they're tracking things and looking for flaws in the system, looking for bottlenecks and stuff like that. It's theory of constraints, right, as well. It's similar to that. So these all overlap, don't they? All of these things, and there's lots of good ideas. Extreme programming, though, is different, isn't it? Because it's exactly about writing software in the best possible way. It's totally focused on that. It's also focused on how you work with one another when you're writing the software, of course, which is part of it. You can't separate those two things. Kanban is about process. It's about the best process we can get and about improving the process. And who would not want to do that? Visualizing the work. Who would not want to visualize the work that we do? It makes life so much easier. So I don't get too caught up on the language, the words of these things and the branding of these things. Kanban is full of good ideas, most of which I think are also in Scrum. So they all cross over. And if you kind of like drop the jargon and actually just talk about the practices in the way that people can comprehend them and get them and know that it's part of what they do anyway, then it makes life much easier.
Yeah, I'm all for dropping the jargon for more reasons than one. One of the other things I've noticed as well is that give humans a system and they'll find a way to screw it up. It's story points or product owners or backlogs or whatever. We have a habit of messing things up.
Well, John, we have a habit of messing things up when they're imposed on us.
Yeah.
When these things come from the ground up, when they grow, then the people doing the work, we can't mess them up because we've made it. It's part of who we are then.
And that's where I'd like to go next, Tobias, because really for me, my dream would be the growth of authentic agility, not imposed agility, and less agile BS and so on. And so what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, I'd just like to read out my attempt at describing value, because that's going to be important when we talk about organizational agility. And then I'm going to try and read out my explanation of what I think organizational agility means, or at least what a starter for 10 could be. Context is everything and so on. But just read it out to you and then let's see where we go, because what do you notice is that's missing really, or, that we are be more positive about, where do we need to focus our energy more so that we do see a lot of this really nice agility or really helping people to do whatever they need to do. So if I start with value, Tobias, so what I'm saying here is it's context sensitive. It's very difficult to measure it. really it's kind of relative. So one thing is probably more important than another. But if we're talking about what is it about each product backlog item, say if it's Scrum, for example, or backlog item if it's Kanban, one of the perspectives would be market value, consumer value, customer value, end user value. So are we delivering outcomes for our customers? Putting it simply. The next one is, part of it doesn't excite me and the other part does. So organizational value. So sometimes, I'm not saying I like this, but so sometimes companies are trying to get rid of waste, or they're trying to cut costs or whatever. But the ones that I think I like more would be employee value. So are we making this a happier place to work, where people are feeling more inspired, happy employees, happy customers kind of thing. But the organization might also be worried about its reputation. So far, market, customer values, and maybe organizational value, if I could oversimplify there. And then in the last few years, we've had the publication of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and they conflict with each other, of course, but a lot of things in life do. But some kind of authentic progress towards that. I don't mean some kind of vanity metric in terms of we've done this, we've done that, but we really are making a difference. This might not be important to the organization, but it's a perspective that you could have, and it's perspective I hope people would have. Maybe less plastic, more diversity and inclusion, less carbon. Pick your goal, really. And then another one which I've been intrigued about is learning in relation to the above. So, maybe doing some discovery experiments, talking to customers, discovering products, services, customers that we wouldn't have been aware of if we just kind of built some stuff. So I'm kind of hinting here at not just delivering, but also discovering where the value is. And so you'd have lots of 21st century lean methods and design thinking that would be kind of going down that route. But a lot of the the Scrums and the Kanbans of the world can do that too. It's just we just need a bit of consideration for learning. And then maybe reducing risk in relation to the above, like John Seddon talks about failure demand, doing something wrong for the customer, driving your project home, but maybe increasing the calls in the call center for complaints. So not doing something right for the customer, or technical mess. A lot of people talk about technical debt, but it's debt if you plan to pay it back. Sometimes we just make a mess. And so I talked about this as being potential perspectives for value. What do you think so far, Tobias? I mean, any comments on what I'm saying so far about value?
No, it all makes sense. I mean, this is what we want people to start thinking about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sure. And oddly, people miss that quite a lot.
Yeah. And so, for example, in Scrum, if the product owner is supposed to be maximizing value, what does that even mean? It's nice to have that conversation, isn't it, about what it is. And so that kind of setting the scene for talking about organizational agility. And so I put together a blog post a few weeks ago on Medium and Scrum.org and a few other places, and I'll just read out the main bit. I won't read the whole lot. And so I have an up arrow and a down arrow in the post. So up arrow meaning there's more of, and down arrow means there's less of. So this is my fourth attempt. So organizational agility is about creating an adaptable organization with a higher possibility to drive disruption in society, the industry, and the marketplace. It's manifested through more effectiveness, as in building the right thing, in optimizing current value, as in like milking the cow we already have, or unrealized value, the cows we haven't found yet, with more frequency of impact, more quality, more learning, less drag, more flow, more efficiency. Interesting, that's the second last word, and more work sustainability. Maybe that should be higher up the list. But what does it look like and what does it feel like? And this is kind of almost like a North Star, if you like, and you could come up with your own version. Of course, you could start with a blank page and come up with your own, but this is just kind of food for thought. So what does it look like? It looks like cognitively diverse people collaboration. And so that doesn't necessarily need to be done through agile. It could be product management or pick your poison, basically pick an approach, set of approaches or principles to follow. But what does it feel like? So it might look like you've got posters on the wall and you've got product owners and scrum masters and Kanban metrics or experiments, all that jargon soup. But does it feel like there's more humanity? Does it feel like we're being authentic about it? Are we really showing leadership? Are our employees or shareholders or customers really more engaged? And instead of just focusing on the next quarter or the current quarter, are we worried about our long-term revenues as well, in terms of how we're going to not just survive, but really be resilient in the future? And I kind of dig in more and more into what humanity means, what authenticity means, and leadership and engagement and so on. I mean, the dictionary describes them. I mean, people don't need to be told what they mean, but just trying to be clear about what they mean. So if I just pick humanity as an example, it might mean that there's more compassion, more invitation, less imposition in terms of ways of working, or less imposition period, more psychological safety. And then you'll see some of the Scrum values here. More trust would be the embodiment of the values, if you like, respect, more team-based commitment. So instead of leaders making the commitments, that teams are making the commitments, more inclusion. And then hat tip to Samantha Ghoshal, more passion, focus, and energy. And of course, what you mustn't forget is more fun, because sometimes what I see, Tobias, is even when it's authentic, it can be a bit sterile. So does it feel like there's a buzz, people enjoying working in this place? I've said a lot there in the last few minutes. I mean, I'm just curious to get your reaction in terms of what you think about this and what thoughts does it trigger for you?
One of the first things that comes up is this use of the term agile. I don't remember the way it was coined. What we call the Agile Manifesto was the manifesto for agile software development. Agile is an adjective, and earlier when you said, is it agile, or can it be something else? Agility is what we're seeking, the ability in this world to move quickly and lightly and to turn direction when we need to and to reconsider things. I mean, these are all agile. We have to be like antelopes or dancers or something. And I think that let's get away from this uppercase agile thing and consider, again, it just comes down to what we might call the essence of the workplace. And all of that stuff you've talked about, we want to build those kind of workplaces. Why would we not? I don't think anyone would actually stand up and say we don't want that, but people don't know how to get it. And I think that's where people like you are coming into this, helping people to see what the pathway looks like to get to this idea of a humane workplace. Too much gets in the way of it. Fear, panic, big profits, shareholders, demands, all those things can trample on a respectful workplace. Hurry gets in the way. So we have to keep reminding people, I suppose, of what are the values and where do those values come from? Are they your own values? Are they imposed on you? I'm very skeptical about all of these big value statements that companies come up with. I've talked about that a number of times now.
Yeah.
We've got to be careful of it because it's easy to tell someone what their values are, but it doesn't mean anything. They won't necessarily live them. But if they come from the person, individual, or the group, or the team themselves, they are much more likely to be authentic and to be lived up to by those people because they own it. Scrum has these 5 values it talks about in their focus, openness, respect, courage, and commitment. And they're just words, aren't they? Nominalizations even. So in order to do Scrum well, you have to really embody those values and understand what they mean to you. Sometimes a really good way of doing that is to look at how you behave in the opposite ways sometimes. When are you distracted rather than focused? When are you fearful rather than courageous? Only by recognizing their opposites do we actually see what the journey looks like to live those values.
It's a very good way of looking at it. It's interesting. What would you say to people who think we can just buy Agility in a box, just install the CD? And
what do you say to that? I don't know. It's like buying love in a box, isn't it, or something? Someone says it's supposed to sell you love in a box and love off the shelf. I mean, people do, don't they? There's a lot of those dating sites. It works out quite well quite a lot of the time for some people. I don't know. You can't package. We do package it. That's what the whole point of the nominalization is. Agile itself is a nominalization. It's an adjective that has been made into a noun in order to sell it. That wasn't the intent when they set out to do this, but that's what's happened to it. You can't sell adjectives. You can only sell things, right? So you make it into a thing and you can sell it. So that's why we have all these abstract nouns, because they become commodities. So what do I say to those people? Good luck. How's that working out for you?
That's probably a very good way to end the interview. Tobias, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
I enjoyed it. Yeah, it's good to hear your work that you're doing and to look at the connections between.
Thank you so much, Tobias.
If you would like your voice message to be featured on a future podcast episode, please leave a voice message at anchor.fm/xagility/message. That's anchor.fm/xagility/message. Thank you.